They say Willow Lane is where the perfect people go to sleep, but some of us are just better at dreaming with our eyes open.
The silence that followed the sound of the turning handle was not empty, but heavy, a physical substance that poured down the staircase and pooled around their ankles, thick with the dust of 20 years and the unspoken terrors that thrive in the quiet corners of old houses. Mark Miller stood frozen, his hand still hovering near the lighter he had flicked only moments before, the flame having long since died, but the heat of the metal still burning against his thumb. And he looked at Martha, the woman who claimed to watch over this street, the woman who claimed to know everything that happened on Willow Lane, and he saw for the first time that her mask had slipped, revealing not the stern protector of the neighborhood watch, but a frightened old woman who realized she had walked into a trap she did not understand.
Evelyn Reed did not move. She did not look up at the ceiling. She did not gasp or recoil, but instead she remained seated in her armchair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the empty fireplace, as if she were waiting for a guest she had invited a long time ago, a guest who was finally, after 2 decades of delays, arriving to collect what was owed.
The creaking of the floorboard above them ceased, replaced by a stillness that was somehow worse, a pregnant pause that suggested whoever or whatever was upstairs had stopped moving not because they were gone, but because they were listening, pressing their ear to the floorboards to hear the breathing of the 3 souls trapped in the parlor below. Mark shifted his weight, the leather of his shoes squeaking against the hardwood, a sound that seemed deafening in the vacuum of the room, and he opened his mouth to whisper, to ask who else had a key, who else could possibly be in a house that Evelyn lived in alone. But Martha raised a hand, a sharp, trembling gesture that commanded silence, her eyes darting toward the hallway, toward the front door, and then back to the stairs, her mind racing through the roster of neighbors, calculating who was home, who was away, and who had the audacity to break into House 12 while the lights were still on. But the sound did not come again from upstairs. Instead, the atmosphere in the room shifted, the air pressure dropping, as if a storm were gathering not outside the windows, where the rain continued its relentless assault against the glass, but inside the very walls of the house, a pressure that pressed against the eardrums and made the heartbeat a little slower, a little harder, thumping against the ribs like a trapped bird. Evelyn finally turned her head, her neck moving with the slow, grinding precision of a rusted mechanism, and she looked at Mark, her eyes devoid of fear, devoid of surprise, filled only with a profound, exhausted resignation. And she spoke, her voice barely a whisper, saying that he should not worry about the upstairs, for the ghosts of this house did not live in the attic. They lived at the front door.
And as if summoned by her words, as if the script of this night had been written long before any of them were born, there was a knock. It was not the frantic pounding of an intruder, nor the polite rapping of a delivery man, but a slow, deliberate, rhythmic thud, 3 times, heavy and authoritative, the sound of wood on wood, the sound of a gavel striking a sounding block, echoing through the hallway and shattering the tension of the upstairs noise, drawing their attention away from the ceiling and toward the entrance, toward the barrier that separated the sanctuary of the living room from the wet, dark reality of Willow Lane.
Martha exhaled, a sound that was half relief and half dread, for she knew that knock. She had heard it in her dreams. She had heard it in the town hall meetings when order was called. She had heard it echoing from the porch of House 1 for as long as she could remember. Mark looked between the 2 women, confused by the shift in their demeanor, confused by the way Evelyn closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the chair, exposing her throat as if accepting a blade. And he took a step toward the hallway, driven by the instinct to protect, to answer, to do something other than stand in the suffocating amber light of the parlor. He walked down the hallway, the
the floorboards groaning under his feet, the shadows stretching out from the coat rack like grasping fingers. And he reached the door, his hand trembling as he gripped the cold brass of the knob. And he hesitated for a fraction of a second, a moment of instinctual warning that told him to leave the door locked, to barricade it, to retreat into the dark and wait for morning. But the knock came again, a single, final thud that demanded obedience.
Mark turned the lock, the mechanism clicking loudly, and he pulled the door open, the wind and the rain rushing in to greet him, bringing with them the smell of wet asphalt and dying leaves. And there, standing on the porch, illuminated by the flickering yellow light of the street lamp, was Judge Marcus Thorne.
He did not look like the titan of Willow Lane in that moment. He did not look like the man who held the keys to the city's secrets. He looked old, impossibly old, his raincoat soaked through and clinging to his frame like a shroud, his white hair plastered to his skull, water dripping from the end of his nose and from his chin, his eyes red, rimmed and hollow, staring past Mark, past the hallway, staring directly into the heart of the house, as if the walls were made of glass.
He did not speak to Mark. He did not acknowledge the young architect's presence. He simply stepped forward, crossing the threshold with a heavy, limping gait, bringing the storm inside him, leaving muddy footprints on the pristine runner rug that Evelyn had kept spotless for 20 years. And Mark found himself stepping aside, pressing his back against the wall to let the old man pass, compelled by a force of personality that required no words, a gravity that bent the will of those around him.
Martha had come to the doorway of the parlor, her hands clutching her cardigan, her face pale. And when she saw Thorne, she did not greet him. She did not ask him what he was doing out in such weather. She simply nodded, a gesture of deference, a gesture of surrender, acknowledging that the hierarchy of the street had reasserted itself, that the queen of the watch was nothing in the presence of the king of the court. Thorne stopped at the entrance to the living room, water pooling around his shoes, and he looked at Evelyn, who had not stood up, who had not opened her eyes, who sat in her chair like a statue carved from grief. And for a long moment, the only sound in the house was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the dripping of water from the judge's coat.
"Leave us," Thorne said, his voice a ruin, a gravelly rasp that sounded like stones grinding together at the bottom of a well. And he did not look at Mark or Martha when he said it. He kept his eyes fixed on Evelyn, his gaze intense and unwavering. Mark bristled, the protective instinct flaring up again, and he stepped into the room, saying that he wasn't going anywhere, that he wanted answers, that they were talking about the fire, about the blackmail, about the files. But Martha reached out and grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, her fingernails digging into his bicep through his shirt, and she shook her head, whispering that it was over, that this was not their conversation to have, that they were merely spectators who had stumbled onto the stage after the curtain had fallen. "Mark," Evelyn said, opening her eyes finally, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the tension like a silver knife. "Please, go home to Sarah. This is between the judge and the librarian."
There was a finality in her tone that brooked no argument, a dismissal that was not unkind but absolute, and Mark looked from Evelyn to Thorne, seeing the invisible tether that connected them, a line of tension and history that was thick and unbreakable. And he realized that he was an intruder here, that his presence was a violation of a ritual that had been decades in the making. He let Martha pull him away, let her guide him back down the hallway, past the dripping raincoat of the judge, out into the cold, wet night. And as the door clicked shut behind them, leaving them on the porch in the rain, Mark felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of relief, a feeling that he had just stepped off the edge of a cliff and been caught by the wind, while inside, the house seemed to contract, sealing itself tight against the world. Inside House 12, the silence returned. But it was different now. It was shared. It was the silence of a confessional booth before the first sin is whispered.
Thorne unbuttoned his raincoat with shaking hands, the wet fabric peeling away to reveal a suit that was wrinkled and stained, a shadow of his usual impeccable attire, and he draped the coat over the back of the sofa, not caring that the water soaked into the upholstery, and he moved to the chair opposite Evelyn, the chair that had been empty for 20 years, the chair that Mark had sat in only minutes before, and he lowered himself into it with a groan of pain, his joints popping, his breath wheezing in his chest.
Evelyn watched him, her expression unreadable, her hands still folded in her lap, and she waited. She let him settle. She let him wipe the rain from his face with a handkerchief that he pulled from his pocket. She let him compose himself, for she was a librarian, and she knew that every story needed time to breathe, that you could not rush the ending just because you were tired of reading.
"You look tired, Marcus," she said softly, the use of his first name sounding strange in the room, an intimacy that felt forbidden, a breach of protocol that shocked the very air. "I am tired, Evelyn," he replied, leaning his head back, his eyes closing for a moment. "I have been tired since 1998. I have been tired since the day I signed the order."
"I have been tired every time I walked past your house and saw the light in the window and knew you were in here, awake, keeping watch over a corpse that we buried together." "It wasn't a corpse, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. "It was a life. It was my life." Thorne opened his eyes and looked at her, and the pain in his gaze was so raw, so naked, that it was difficult to look at, a mixture of love and loathing that had fermented over 2 decades into a poison that was slowly killing him. "We did what was necessary," he said, the old judicial authority trying to creep back into his voice, but failing, crumbling under the weight of the truth. "We protected the street. We protected the name." "We protected you. You protected yourself," Evelyn countered, but there was no venom in it, only a weary correction of the record. "You protected the sanctity of the court. You couldn't have a scandal. You couldn't have the wife of a prominent developer arrested for arson. You couldn't have the messy, ugly truth spilling out onto the manicured lawns of Willow Lane."
"Is that what you think?" Thorne asked, leaning forward, his hands gripping the arms of the chair, his knuckles white. "Is that what you've told yourself all these years in this dark house? That I did it for the reputation? That I did it for the politics?" "I have the file, Marcus," she said, nodding toward the desk in the corner, the desk where the tape recorder still sat, the tape having run out, the reel spinning uselessly in silence. "I know what's in it. I know you suppressed the fire marshal's report. I know you paid off the insurance investigator. I know you destroyed the witness statements that placed me at the scene with the gasoline." "You have the file," Thorne repeated, a bitter smile touching his lips. "Yes, the leverage, the sword of Damocles you've hung over my head." "The reason I let you stay here, the reason I let you rot in this mausoleum, instead of sending you to a facility where you could have gotten help," he laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "But you never opened the sealed envelope at the back, did you, Evelyn? You read the reports, you read the bribes, but you never opened the personal letter I wrote to the file, the one I sealed with my own ring." Evelyn frowned, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "There is no letter." "There is," Thorne said, tucked behind the photos of the charred nursery, tucked behind the blackened remains of the crib. "I put it there. I knew you would steal the file. I knew you would keep it. I knew you needed to feel like you had power over me, because if you didn't have power over me, you would have to face the fact that you had no power over yourself." He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a weapon, but for a cigarette case, a silver antique that he hadn't used in years, and he opened it, finding it empty, and he closed it again with a snap, his hands trembling. "I didn't save you because of the scandal, Evelyn.
I didn't save you because of the court. I saved you because I loved you."
The words hung in the air, absurd and terrifying, transforming the narrative of the last 20 years from a political thriller into a tragedy of errors. Evelyn stared at him, her mouth slightly open, her mind reeling, trying to recontextualize every interaction, every glance, every moment of silence between them. "You loved me?" she whispered, the idea foreign, repulsed by it. "You barely spoke to me. You were my husband's friend."
"And watched you fade," Thorne said, his voice gaining strength, fueled by the confession. "I watched him crush you. I watched him build this neighborhood, this perfect little prison of Willow Lane, and I watched him brick you up inside it. I saw the bruises you covered with makeup. I saw the way you flinched when he raised his voice. I saw the light going out in your eyes, year after year, until there was nothing left but a shadow." He took a breath, the sound rattling in his chest. "And then came the fire. The fire at the old construction site. The fire that burned down the model home. The fire that was meant to destroy his legacy." He looked at her directly, his eyes piercing. "I knew it was you. Before the police, before the marshals. I saw you walking back that night. I saw the smell of gasoline on your hands, and when the case came to my desk, I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let him destroy you twice. So I destroyed the law instead." Evelyn sat back, the revelation washing over her, not as a comfort, but as a horror. She had thought she was the villain. She had thought she was the mastermind, the arsonist who had gotten away with it, the woman who held the judge hostage with her dark secret. But now, in the dim light of the parlor, she realized she had been the charity case. She had been the broken bird that the judge had wrapped in illicit legal protections, not out of fear, but out of a twisted, silent pity. "I didn't want to be saved," she said, her voice trembling, her composure finally cracking. "I didn't want your pity, Marcus. I wanted to burn it down. I wanted to burn it all down. I wanted to stand in the ashes and scream." "I wanted to go to prison. At least in prison, the walls are honest. At least in prison, you know why you're there." "And yet," Thorne said softly, "you stayed. You stayed in the house he built. You stayed on the street he designed. You kept the file. Why, Evelyn? If you wanted to burn it all down, why didn't you release the file? Why didn't you turn me in? Why didn't you confess?" Evelyn looked around the room, at the heavy curtains, at the dust motes dancing in the lamplight, at the shadows that clung to the corners like spiderwebs. "Because," she whispered, the truth finally being dragged out of her, "because if I turned you in, then the story ends. And if the story ends, then I'm just a lonely old woman who set a fire because she was sad. As long as I kept the file. As long as I kept the secret, I was dangerous. I was powerful. I was the crow's nightmare. I was the judge's reckoning." She looked at Thorne, her eyes filling with tears that did not fall. "I needed to be the monster, Marcus, because being the victim was too painful." Thorne nodded slowly, understanding, accepting. He stood up, his knees cracking, and he walked over to the desk. He didn't ask for permission. He picked up the manila folder that had been the center of so much speculation, the folder that Julian Vane had wanted to buy, that Martha had wanted to bury, that Mark had wanted to understand. He weighed it in his hand, feeling the density of the paper, the density of the years. He didn't open it. He didn't look for the letter he claimed was inside. He simply held it, and then he turned and walked to the fireplace.
"Marcus," Evelyn said, half rising from her chair, "what are you doing?" "The statute of limitations has long passed, Evelyn," he said, his voice flat. "The court is closed. The husband is dead. The neighborhood has moved on. There are new people now, tech consultants, crypto investors. They don't care about our sins. They have their own."
He struck a match from the box on the mantel, the sound distinct and sharp, and he held the flame to the corner of the folder. The paper caught, curling and browning, the fire eating the secrets, consuming the lies, turning the evidence into smoke and ash. He held it until the heat threatened his fingers, until the flames were licking at the seal, and then he tossed it into the grate, onto the cold ashes of fires long extinguished.
They watched it burn together. They watched the police reports curl up and vanish. They watched the witness statements turn to gray flakes. They watched the leverage, the blackmail, the power dissolve into nothingness. When the fire died down, leaving only a few glowing embers in the darkness of the grate, Thorne turned back to her. He looked lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but also emptier, as if his purpose had burned away with the paper. "You're free, Evelyn," he said. "No one is coming for you. No one is watching you. Martha will not speak. Mark will not speak. I will not speak." He walked back to the sofa and picked up his wet coat, shrugging it on, the dampness settling back over him like a second skin. He buttoned it slowly, his fingers clumsy. "Free?" Evelyn laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You call this free? You've taken away the only thing that made me matter. You've taken away my leverage. You've taken away my war." "The war was over 20 years ago," Thorne said, walking to the hallway. "We were just the only ones who didn't know it." He stopped at the front door, his hand on the knob, and he looked back one last time.
The house seemed to stretch out behind Evelyn, the hallway endless, the stairs leading up to the darkness where the floorboard had creaked, the kitchen where the knives were kept, the library where the books were unread. "Goodbye, Evelyn," he said. "I won't be coming back. I'm selling the house. I'm moving to the coast. My daughter has a room for me." "You're leaving?" she asked, a sudden panic rising in her chest. "You can't leave."
"I was," he said. "Now I'm just an old man who wants to hear the ocean instead of the rain." He opened the door, and the wind howled, blowing rain into the hallway, swirling around his feet. He stepped out onto the porch, and without looking back, he pulled the door shut. The click of the latch was the loudest sound Evelyn had ever heard. She stood alone in the hallway. The house was silent.
The file was gone. The judge was gone. Martha was gone. Mark was gone. She walked slowly back into the living room. She looked at the fireplace, where the last embers of the file were fading into gray ash. She looked at the chair where Thorne had sat, the indentation of his body still visible in the cushion, the wet spot on the armrest where his sleeve had rested. She sat down in her own chair. She folded her hands in her lap. She listened to the house. She heard the wind rattling the window panes. She heard the rain drumming on the roof. She heard the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. She heard the settling of the foundation, the groan of the timbers, the whisper of the drafts. And then she heard it again, from upstairs, the distinct, unmistakable creak of the floorboard right beside her bed. Evelyn froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs.
She looked up at the ceiling. Thorne was gone. Mark and Martha were gone. She was alone. Or was she? She remembered what Thorne had said about the letter in the file. "I knew you would steal the file. I knew you needed to feel like you had power." She remembered the noise that had started it all tonight, the handle turning, She realized with a cold, dawning horror that the noise upstairs hadn't been a ghost. It hadn't been the wind.
It hadn't been a cat. The house was old. The house had secrets. The house had spaces between the walls, spaces in the attic, spaces that a person could live in if they were quiet, if they were careful, if they had nowhere else to go. She thought of the food that sometimes went missing from her pantry. She thought of the books that were sometimes moved on the shelves. She thought of the way the house always felt, occupied. She had blamed it on her own forgetfulness. She had blamed it on the ghosts of her past. She had blamed it on the paranoia of her guilt. But as the floorboard creaked again, followed by the soft, rhythmic sound of pacing, back and forth, like a caged animal, Evelyn Reed realized the true nature of her punishment. She wasn't the warden of Willow Lane. She wasn't the powerful blackmailer holding the judge hostage. She wasn't even the tragic heroine of a romance. She was the inmate, and she was not in solitary confinement. She sat in the amber light, the silence of the street pressing in on all sides, and she stared up at the ceiling, listening to the footsteps of the unknown, the realization settling over her like the dust that covered every surface of her life. She could leave. She could stand up, walk to the door, open it, and run into the rain. She could run to Mark's house. She could run to the police. But she didn't move, because this was her house. This was her prison. This was her life. And whatever was upstairs, whatever had been living in the shadows of House 12, watching her, listening to her, breathing the same air as her for 20 years, it was the only family she had left. Evelyn Reed closed her eyes. She leaned her head back.
"I know you're there," she whispered to the ceiling, her voice calm, measured, and terrified. The pacing stopped. The house held its breath. And in the silence, Evelyn waited for the floorboard to creak again, knowing that the story of Willow Lane didn't end with a bang, or a fire, or a confession. It ended with the waiting. It ended with the darkness.
It ended with the neighbor at the end of the street, sitting in a chair, listening to the sound of something waking up above her head. The silence that followed her whisper was not empty, but heavy, a tangible substance that seemed to pour down from the ceiling like invisible smoke, filling the room with a pressure that made the simple act of drawing breath feel like a labor against the weight of the house itself. She sat frozen in the amber light, her eyes fixed on the plaster above, waiting for the floorboard to creak again, waiting for the unknown tenant of her attic to acknowledge her challenge, waiting for the inevitable descent of whatever had been sharing her air for all these lonely years.
But the house offered no reply, only the settling of its ancient bones and the relentless, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the siding, a sound that washed over the world outside and sealed her into this capsule of time and memory. She was prepared for the ceiling to crack open. She was prepared for footsteps on the stairs. She was prepared for the terrifying reality of a stranger's face emerging from the shadows of the hallway. But she was not prepared for the sound that actually came. It was a knock. It was not the frantic pounding of a fugitive, nor the authoritative hammer of the police, but a soft, almost hesitant rap of knuckles against the heavy oak of the front door, a sound so polite and so incongruous with the terror of the moment that it shattered the spell of the upstairs room instantly.
Evelyn lowered her gaze from the ceiling, her neck stiff, her mind reeling as it tried to recalibrate from the threat above to the visitor below, and for a moment she simply stared at the front door, watching the brass handle dull in the low light, wondering if her mind had finally fractured enough to hallucinate the mundane courtesy of a guest.
The knock came again, 3 distinct taps, gentle yet insistent, demanding nothing
but begging for acknowledgement. And Evelyn found herself standing up, her movements mechanical, drawn toward the entryway not by courage, but by the sheer magnetic pull of the inevitability that had been stalking her all night. She walked past the staircase, forcing herself not to look up into the dark well of the second floor, forcing herself to ignore the lingering sensation of being watched from the balustrade. And she reached the door, her hand hovering over the lock, her breath held tight in her chest, as she imagined the horrors that might be waiting on the porch. She turned the latch.
The mechanism clicked, a sharp metallic sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet house, and she pulled the heavy door inward, revealing the wet, gray world of Willow Lane and the figure standing under the dripping eaves. It was Judge Thorne.
But it was not the Thorne of the courthouse, not the titan of industry who intimidated waitresses and silenced courtrooms with a glare. It was a man eroded by the rain and the years, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a soaking wet trench coat, his silver hair plastered to his skull, his face a landscape of ruin and exhaustion, illuminated by the flickering porch light.
He did not barge in. He did not shout. He did not wave a pistol or a subpoena. He simply stood there, water dripping from the tip of his nose, looking at her with eyes that held no anger, no malice, only a profound and terrifying sorrow that chilled Evelyn more than any threat could have. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice was a rusted hinge, a sound that scraped against the silence of the night. She stepped back, allowing him to cross the threshold, and as he entered the foyer, bringing the smell of ozone and wet wool and dying leaves with him, she realized that the dynamic she had constructed in her head for 20 years, the game of cat and mouse, the blackmailer and the victim, the warden and the prisoner, was a lie she had told herself to survive the crushing weight of her own history. Thorne closed the door behind him, shutting out the wind, and he leaned against the frame as if his legs could no longer support the burden of his secrets, and he looked at her, really looked at her, with the intimacy of a co-conspirator who has finally grown too tired to run. "I saw the lights," he whispered, his gaze drifting past her to the living room where the file still lay open on the table, the papers scattered like the debris of a wreck.
"I knew you were reading it. I knew it was time."
Evelyn wanted to speak. She wanted to hurl the accusations at him. She wanted to demand to know why he had tormented her, why he had let her live in fear, why he had allowed the specter of the investigation to hang over her head like a guillotine blade. But the words died in her throat, because as she looked at him, the memories she had repressed, the memories she had buried under layers of paranoia and victimhood, began to claw their way to the surface.
She looked at the file on the table, and suddenly she wasn't seeing the black and white photos of a crime scene. She was seeing the color of the flames. She remembered the smell of gasoline, sharp and chemical, stinging her nose in the garage of the old house on Elm Street, not in 1998, but in a lifetime that felt like a dream. She remembered the shaking of her own hands, not the hands of a victim, but the hands of an architect of destruction, striking the match that would burn down a marriage she couldn't escape, a debt she couldn't pay, a life that had become a cage so small she could no longer breathe within its bars.
She remembered the heat, the blistering, purifying heat that had consumed the evidence of her failures, and she remembered standing in the crowd as the sirens wailed, watching the roof collapse, weeping not for the loss, but for the terrifying, exhilarating relief of erasure. Thorne watched the realization wash over her face, and he nodded slowly, a single tear tracking through the rain on his cheek.
"You thought I kept the file to control you," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "You thought I was the villain who held your crime over your head, to keep you silent, to keep you close, to keep you here in this house."
He took a step toward her, and for the first time,
Evelyn saw the truth of his obsession, the twisted, tragic reality of the man who had presided over her case, the judge who had looked at the evidence of her arson, the proof of her guilt, and had chosen not to sentence her, but to save her. "I didn't hide the evidence to protect myself, Evelyn," he whispered, the confession hanging in the air like smoke.
"I destroyed my integrity. I ruined the investigation. I buried the truth of what you did because I loved you." The world tilted on its axis. The floorboards seemed to vanish beneath her feet. Evelyn reached out to steady herself against the wall, her mind reeling as the narrative of her life was rewritten in a single heartbeat. She was not the prey. She was the predator who had been protected by the very man she despised.
She had kept the file for 20 years, thinking it was her insurance policy, thinking it was the leash she held around the judge's neck, never realizing that it was actually a receipt for the soul he had sold to keep her out of prison. "I kept the file," Thorne continued, his voice breaking, "because it was the only thing I had that proved we were connected. It was the only thing that bound us together."
"I wanted you to hate me, Evelyn, because if you hated me, you would think about me, and if you were afraid of me, you would never leave." He reached into his coat pocket, and Evelyn flinched, expecting a weapon. But he pulled out nothing. His hand came out empty, open, a gesture of surrender that was more final than any gunshot.
"But I am tired," he said, and the exhaustion in his voice was a physical thing, a deep, marrow-deep weariness that spoke of decades of sleepless nights and silent vigils. "I am tired of being the villain in your story so that you can pretend to be the victim. I am tired of watching you rot in this house, guarding a secret that everyone else has forgotten."
He turned back to the door, his hand resting on the brass knob, and he looked at her one last time, his eyes hollow, his expression void of expectation. "You are free, Evelyn," he said softly. "Not because I am letting you go, but because I am no longer willing to be your jailer. You set the fire. You burned down your life. And you have spent 20 years standing in the ashes, waiting for someone to tell you it's okay to walk away." He opened the door, and the sound of the rain rushed in, louder now, a crescendo of water and wind that smelled of freedom and cold, hard reality. "The file is yours," he whispered, stepping out into the night. "Burn it, keep it. It doesn't matter anymore." And then he was gone.
He walked down the porch steps, his figure dissolving into the gloom of the street, his footsteps swallowed by the storm, leaving Evelyn standing in the open doorway, the cold mist spraying against her face, the file on the table behind her, and the devastating silence of the house settling around her shoulders like a shroud.
She watched him disappear until the darkness was absolute, until there was no judge, no neighbor, no witness left in the world. And then, slowly, mechanically, she closed the door. She locked it. She slid the deadbolt home. She engaged the chain. She turned around and looked at the hallway. She was alone. The blackmailer was gone. The threat of prison was gone. The game was over. She was the arsonist. She was the criminal. And she was free.
But as she stood there, the silence of the house began to change, shifting from the emptiness of departure to the heavy, expectant pressure of presence. She looked at the file on the table. It was just paper. It had always been just paper. And then she heard it from upstairs, the creak of the floorboard.
It was louder this time, deliberate, a shifting of weight that was too heavy for a rat, too rhythmic for the wind, too purposeful for a settling beam. Evelyn froze, her hand still resting on the cold metal of the door chain, her eyes lifting slowly, painfully,
to the top of the staircase, where the shadows gathered in a dense, impenetrable pool. Thorne had said she was free. Thorne had said he was done watching her.
But Thorne didn't know everything about House 12. Thorne didn't know that the house had its own memory, its own hunger, its own occupants who had been waiting patiently while the two humans played their petty games of guilt and redemption downstairs. The creak came again, followed by the soft sliding sound of a door opening in the hallway above, the door to the spare room, the room she never entered, the room where she had heard the breathing.
Evelyn didn't run. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for the phone to call the police, because she knew, with a clarity that was colder than the rain, that the police could not arrest what was up there, and that her sentence had not been commuted, but merely clarified. She walked to the bottom of the stairs. She placed her hand on the newel post, feeling the vibrations of the movement above, traveling down the wood like a pulse.
She looked up into the dark. "I'm coming up," she whispered. And as she took the first step, the phone in the kitchen began to ring.